as always, and with reflection, we want to remind everyone that we're hosting this session on the unceded and ancestral territory of the Coast Salish peoples. That includes the territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, Tsleil-Waututh Nations, and the Métis Charter Community of the Lower Mainland, and that all of you around this province or elsewhere in the country are on also territories. And paying our respects to elders past, present, and emerging is really important, as well as committing to the land. And this is in the spirit of truth and reconciliation, and also of deepening our learning and understanding. And so with this, I'm going to remind everybody that Province-Wide Rounds is a collaboration between the University of British Columbia Division of Nephrology and BC Renal, all of our health authority partners and our industry partners that make this educational venue and activity possible. And so with that, next slide, I'm going to pass it over to Dr. John Gill to introduce our speaker, Dr. James Lan. Over to you, John.
Good morning, everyone. I just want to add my comments to the land acknowledgement. It's been a particularly beautiful week in Vancouver, and I feel very fortunate to be free, healthy, and alive living here. This morning, it's a great pleasure for me to introduce my friend and colleague, Dr. James Lan. Many of you will know James, but it's important to get all of his affiliations acknowledged. So he is jointly appointed in the UBC Department of Pathology and Laboratory Medicine, as well as the Department of Medicine and the Division of Nephrology. He's the medical director of the HLA lab at Vancouver Hospital, which supports all the transplant programs, including a solid organ and bone marrow transplant in the province. In addition to his clinical roles as a transplant nephrologist, James is an active researcher. He's a recipient of Michael Smith Scholarship Award and holds multiple research grants. His interest really is in immunogenetics and applying technologies to improve really compatibility in all sorts of transplantations, and to talk about new solutions to improve access for patients who currently have poor access. Without further ado, today, James is going to talk about very innovative work to really transform an old metric, which is cPRA, to improve access. James, welcome. Over to you, sir.
Thanks very much, John and Nadira. Good morning, everyone. A real pleasure to be here today. So this work started about 2 years ago, and I remember it was just like any other day. I was in the lab drinking coffee and did a little thought experiment. And then what happened for the following 2 years really took us around the world in terms of coming up with a new metric. And I never certainly done this before, having the opportunity to coin a new term, to develop a new metric, but more importantly, to implement a new system of kidney allocation, which I think would be very useful, not just for Canada, but other countries as well. So I thank you for the platform today to discuss this work. I've given this talk many times in the US, and I typically tell them that I'm a Canadian, I'll be presenting Canadian data, but for the audience today, I would say that I will be definitely discussing the US data. And partly because I think as I did this work, I started to appreciate how much the two countries kind of worked off of each other to develop the allocation system that we have today across the border. I don't have any financial relationships to disclose for this. So I just begin by talking about allocation. I remember when I was training with John, he always told me that it's not just you're going to become a transplant nephrologist, you're not just taking care of patients, but you are going to be a gatekeeper of the organ allocation system in BC and in our country. And I didn't fully appreciate that. I think we all have this inherent feeling that, yes, we're going to be allocating a precious resource, and we must do it by certain principles such as utility and equity. But I really started to understand this a little bit more as I started to realize that the work that we did will actually have a big impact on kidney allocation, and that we must make sure that it is following these principles and the data is robust so that we actually achieve both utility and equity. And so to begin the story, I will just start in the United States. I was interested to see how did we arrive at the current kidney allocation system that we have today. And Mark Stegall actually wrote this paper several years ago. The transplant field, I think is interesting. Now we're at a cusp where a lot of the senior transplanters are kind of retired or have retired, but they did all the groundwork to build the allocation system that we have today. And then we have the new generation of younger people who are taking this work forward. So I feel compelled that we have to understand, well, how did we get to where we are today? Because as he says in the first quote, if we don't know the past, we're destined to repeat it. And when I looked into it, where the allocation kind of a framework originated was, at least in the US, a lot had to do with the 2000 OPT and final rule. And essentially that was the time when the federal government came up with a set of principles that defined the framework of the allocation system in the United States. And I think a lot of these principles I put down there, we can agree with. And importantly, in principle number 5, it says we have to promote patient access to transplant. And that's relevant because there was a time, I think, for us that saw before 2010, the new implementation system, there was a time when highly sensitized patients had very poor access. And that was partially why the OPT and final rule put that in there and really provided the impetus for histogenetics community to develop a better metric to measure sensitization and therefore to allocate organs better to achieve equity. So when we talk about allocation and equity, it struck me that they have a lot to do with sensitization. This biologic disadvantage that many of our patients, through no fault of their own that they have, either through pregnancy or blood transfusion or prior transplants. And the link to the lab here is that sensitization is measured by a metric that we developed in the lab called, in the previous era, PRA, and now cPRA. And then it struck me that, as a lab personnel, we have an obligation to make sure our metric is really accurate as it should be, because if it's not, it will have a profound impact on allocation and therefore equity in terms of organ access to transplant. So I promise I won't get into too much in the weeds about laboratory stuff. This is the only slide I have about methodology. But I wanted to just discuss two things. One is, well, where did PRA come from? And how did we land in cPRA? So in the 1960s, through Paul Terasaki's work, basically, there was this idea that came forward is if we are going to see a transplant patient, it would be useful to tell them how likely it is you're going to find a match in a population. But how the heck are we going to do that? And so he developed a very simple method is if you have the patient's serum and they have antibodies, well, it would be useful to know what proportion of a population that they're going to react with. And then knowing that concept, all one has to do is to find, well, 50 to 100 volunteers, they represent the local donor pool. And then you put all of their cells into the wells here, and you incubate all of them with the patient's serum. And then you can calculate percentage of amongst these wells, how many of them had a positive reaction. And that was your PRA, effectively. So it was an estimate to see patient's serum, presumably with anti-HLA antibodies, how much did that react with the donor population. But as you can imagine, where do they source these volunteers? I can tell you it wasn't very sophisticated back in the days. They were getting these volunteers either from the lab or from students or from just whoever they can find around their local site. And certainly that was the case in Vancouver, that a lot of these donors for these reactions came from the lab. Paul can tell you that he had his blood drawn many times. So the issue with this is that PRA is then very widely based on the location, because every lab was doing their own kind of panel, and also the method of testing. So imagine now, you can really appropriately allocate organs to highly sensitized patients because this measure wasn't standardized. You could have one person saying that this patient in Vancouver has a PRA of 50%, but if they move to, let's say, my friend and colleague, Rob Buski's lab in Halifax, they have a different composition. All of a sudden, their PRA could be higher or lower. And so that was partially the reason why highly sensitized patients couldn't really get transplanted well back in that era. So as in the field in transplant, we all remember cPRA came around in 2009, a little later in Canada, which I'll get into why. But really the fundamental change here in idea is that the calculation is no longer based on a laboratory test. Whereas before you had to do a physical test to inform PRA, now this is a calculated metric. So what does that really mean? Is over time, we started to accumulate the HLA frequency in the population. And that's very useful because the concept here is that if we have a patient, they have an antibody to A2, but then we know how frequently A2 occurs in the population. Let's say this is a population of 100 people, and A2 occurs in 50% of a population. All of a sudden, without doing any laboratory tests, you can say, well, this person's PR is 50% because I know they have an antibody to A2, and A2 occurs in 50% of a population. So by definition, 50% of a population, they're not going to be compatible with this candidate. And because of that, we all of a sudden have a couple of things that happen here. Number one, we don't have to rely on a laboratory test, which is quite varied. Number two is we have a standardized method of measuring sensitization. And therefore, quickly, the transplant community took this metric, and now they can do this for all the candidates on the wait list. And this is what we effectively do in the lab. We do antibody tests first on all the patients that are listed for transplant. And let's say this candidate have A2, we check off the A2 box, they have a B7, we check it off. And then we put it into the calculator, we click on calculate. And we see that they have a CPR 69% based on antibody to A2, A24, and B7. And then that allows us clinicians to really develop a framework of kidney allocation to help patients who are highly sensitized. And that's what led to the kidney allocation system that they have in the US. And what I'm trying to show here is that as the cPRA increases, we know these patients have a biologic disadvantage, and we have to help them by giving them more points so they get higher priority. Before 2014, in the era of PRA, from 0 to 80%, you can see they got 0 points. And all of a sudden, they got 4 points. Now, 4 points is not very much. And as a result, a lot of these highly sensitized patients, particularly 90 to 100%, they got no offers. But look what they did now, because we have a standard calculated method, what they did is they do a sliding scale. That is, the patient's cPRA goes up higher, all of a sudden, the number of points that they get is higher. And what you see on this scale here is that this is the log scale. A lot of people who are not familiar with it, they'll feel like 1% change is the same across a scale, and that is not true. For instance, if you start at 0%, you go from 0 to 1%, your donor pool is not changed significantly. You go from 100 donors that are compatible to 99. But if you go from 99% to 100%, that one single change of 1% is very different, because all of a sudden you went from 1 out of 100 donor pool to 1 much less, and it could be as low as 1 in 10,000 donors. And so this is a log scale. And as soon as they took that new cPRA metric, they implemented that together with the allocation framework, what they saw was a markedly increase in terms of access for transplant. And this is a metric that Darren Stewart came out with in UNOS as a way to measure access to transplant. And the higher means it's less equitable, and the lower means more equitable. And you can see right at 2014, there was a rapid improvement in the equity of access to transplant post-implementation of CAS in 2014. Okay, so what did we cover so far? What we cover is that there's an interplay between cPRA and kidney allocation. We talked about how PRA originated as a laboratory test, and that was used to estimate the likelihood of finding a cross-match compatible donor. And then we saw that transform into cPRA, which is now used clinically as a surrogate for patient access to transplant. And more importantly, we started to build allocation policies based on cPRA, giving priority for candidates with increasing cPRA. In the US, they have the sliding scale. In Canada, we're all familiar here is we have the Canadian Highly Sensitized program. And this program started in 2013. And we're a little different from the US. We don't have a sliding scale, but we said that if your CPR is 95% or higher, you go into interprovincial sharing. So I think all this framework makes a lot of sense because fundamentally, we want to help patients with a biologic disadvantage because of their access to transplant limited by anti-HLA antibodies. So I did a thought experiment about 2 years ago. I said, well, if CPR is truly a good measure of global immune compatibility, and I said that's not true, because the immune compatibility should include HLA and ABO, because we all know that when it comes to transplant, often the first question we ask is not the HLA antibody, is what is your blood type? However, we currently have a metric that really measures HLA. It doesn't really account for ABO. So when I had this idea, I said, well, did our field get it wrong the whole time? Somehow, somewhere along the way, we kind of really focus our brain on HLA. We ignore ABO. And of course, I thought I got it wrong. I'm like, someone must have thought about this before. So I went to the esteemed Dr. Young, who is an encyclopedia. I asked him, I said, Paul, tell me I'm wrong here, because I don't think people thought about this, but I can't be the only person who's thought about this. And Paul says, you know what, James, I've been around for a long time. I don't think people have thought about this. But Paul is a visionary, but sometimes his memory is a little forgetful. So he said, I should talk to someone who's more contemporaneous. And I went to the next person, which is Dr. Gill. I said, John, like, tell me I'm wrong here, because I think, this idea makes so much sense to me, but I can't imagine that no one else has thought about it. John says, I don't think people have done this before, but I'm not a histogenetics person. You should talk to someone who knows what they're doing. Then he introduced me to Howie Gable, who is a giant in the field of histocompatibility in transplantation. And there I really got a boost of confidence, because Howie told me, he said, James, it is a great idea. No one's done it in our field. I can tell you that. You should take that forward, but you're going to need help. And what he meant is he knew I would get into very heavy computational things that we had to do to address this metric. And he said, there is this person, he's really good. He's a young investigator just like you. You should meet him. And there I got to meet Lauren Greger, who has a very interesting background in computation, is a director in training at Tulane University, and has been a fantastic friend and collaborator. And there we got met up with UNOS folks, Darren Stewart, who previously really worked with UNOS and came up with a lot of the analyses that led to the allocation system that we have today. And he has recently now transitioned to working at NYU. And so that was kind of the link that we had along the way. But when I met Lauren, he immediately understood what I was trying to say. And we clicked right away and we embarked on this study. So we said, how are we going to do this? We're going to really revamp this metric here. We said, well, why don't we just treat anti-ABO antibodies? Because depending on your blood type, you make antibodies against the other ABO blood group. So for instance, if you're blood group A, you will have antibody against B. If you're blood group B, you will have antibody against blood group A. So we said, why don't we just take the antibody against the other blood group, we combine that with anti-HLA antibodies, and then we can award allocation points and priority based on this, what we call the unified ABO-adjusted cPRA. So our goal was to come up with a comprehensive, a new immunologic metric for sensitization. So how does the concept work? So imagine we have a donor pool of 100 people, and we have a blood group O candidate with a single antibody to DR53. What's their cPRA? Well, DR53 is present in 50% of the population, and therefore currently that candidate has a PRA of 50%. But the problem with that is you assume this candidate has access to the rest of the donor pool, which is 50%. In reality, we know that's not true, because when you look at this person's blood group, which is O, they can only get access to a O candidate in the donor. And when you account for that, basically, these other candidates, these donor pools, they're out. They have a A or B or AB blood group, and therefore they're not compatible. So when you combine the two, the ABO-adjusted cPRA is the cPRA from the HLA contribution plus the ABO is 50% plus 26% for ABO is 76%. So it's a very simple idea, but computationally, we have to write down an equation for this, which is over here. Again, the baseline cPRA plus the factor of ABO adjustment. We did this very quickly on a piece of paper, actually, and Lauren put that into work. And we published this paper recently in HAT that came out, which I think will really transform allocation across the border. And so what we did here is we took the US data set we had about 200,000 candidates in the United States in 2018. And we had their ABO phenotype and their anti-HLA antibodies listed in the UNOS registry. And the method was very straightforward. We just have their cPRA, traditional cPRA, and also we did an ABO adjustment. And we had to really do some work to get the ABO adjustment correct, because the ABO frequency in the donor population is really not well captured overall. So what we did is we took all the deceased donors in the US from 2000 to 2021, and we broke it down by their ethnicity and also by their blood group. And right away, what you already see is, you can imagine, why do we see a lot of ethnic disparity when it comes to access to transplant? Look at the black candidates. When you come to blood group B, the number of black candidates who are blood group B is twice as many as the Caucasians. But let's look at Asians. We're even higher for Asians. And the data for Asians is very minimal in the United States, but it's much more dramatic here in Canada. And what's also lacking here is, how can we apply this to Canada? Is we don't have any indigenous data here for the United States, whereas we have a number of really a large indigenous populations in Canada, which I would say this is an area that's not really fully developed yet. So we did this donor frequency calculation for ABO, and then we mapped it to our cPRA metric. And the high-level overview is we wanted to understand what would happen if we did a recalculation adjusting for ABO. And what you see here is the baseline cPRA of using traditional cPRA for all the candidates. And on the y-axis, what we're showing here is what proportion of the candidates would have a change in cPRA after ABO adjustment. And to give you an example over here, if someone's currently 99%, if you take all comers who are currently 99%, after accounting for ABO, 44% of them should actually be considered as 100%. And you can see that effect is quite dramatic. A lot of patients who are much lower in cPRA, 97, 98, actually have a large increment in their cPRA now after accounting for ABO. The most important thing is that that effect is not uniform. It really varies a lot by your blood group, as you can imagine. So blood group A candidates, they do go up, but not as significant as blood group B, as you can see, and also blood group O candidates. The AB blood groups, they don't really change at all, because AB, they're the universal acceptors. They can take any blood group, they're all compatible with AB. So that's why they don't have a correction for ABO. But that correction is quite significant for blood group B and O candidates. So just to demonstrate how would that affect access to transplant for someone, if we take all comers who currently have a 99.25% in terms of the cPRA, but then we stratify by their blood group, what would happen to them? Well, we see the majority of B candidates and the O candidates who are 99.25 by the current system, they all of a sudden move into 99.5 or higher. So why do we care about that? We care about that is because that is the cut point when you make it into 100%. 100% is effectively 99.5 rounded up into 100%. So what's the implication of that? Well, the implication is that in the United States, if your cPRA is 100%, you have national access to organ, which means that if you're in California, you can get a donor anywhere in the country as long as they're matched to you. But if you're 99%, you don't get national organ sharing. Your donor pool is restricted to your local 250 nautical miles. And so all of a sudden you got a metric. And just to go back here again, if you're a blood group AB candidate, you get a local regional offers. But the blood group B and O, they really should be considered 100% and get national access, but they're not being recognized for their biologic disadvantage. So we at that time we had a decision to make. We can either do even more work, and I think the clinician in us, we wanted to say, well, but tell me the full impact of ABO-adjusted cPRA. I think that was the issue that we had, is we wanted to show, if you apply this metric, how can we make things better, rather than to just have a thought experiment. But we feel compelled that the idea just has to get out first, just to say that we're the first ones to do this, and then continue the rest of the work. So we published that paper first, But then we had to decide, well, how are we going to model the impact of ABO-adjusted cPRA and equity to kidney transplantation? And so we decided we're going to do this in Canada. And there's a difference between the Canadian system and the US system. And the difference is quite profound. In the US, they do ABO-identical kidney allocation. For instance, A to A, B to B, O to O, AB to AB. But in Canada, if you're in a highly sensitized program, there's ABO-compatible allocation, which means that if you're AB, you can get access to A donors, the B donor pool, the O donor pool, and the AB. And therefore, we predicted that this ABO disparity would actually be greater in the Canadian system than in the US system, because here they restrict you to your own lane. But in Canada, because we mix between blood groups and we don't account for that effect with our metric, that disparity would actually be more. So imagine this scenario that in Canada, what would happen? If you're a blood group AB candidate, your cPRA is 99%, but look at your donor pool is the entire country. All the donors are going to be eligible for this AB candidate who's got 99% cPRA. A similar candidate who's blood group O, they're also 99%, but relatively their donor pool is much smaller. They just have the blood group O donors that are eligible to them because other donors, they're blood group incompatible. But consider this scenario over here. What if the AB candidate and the B candidate, they're competing against a single donor? Let's say this blood group O donor happens to match this AB candidate and this B at the same time. Who's going to win? Well, right now, this AB candidate is going to win because their CPR is 99%. It trumps the B candidate who has a CPR 97%. But the part that's lacking here is because, as I hope I convinced you, cPRA is not the whole story. The full story is that after ABO adjustment, the actual donor pool is much more restricted for B. Their actual cPRA should be 100%. It should really trump the AB candidate. But because this ABO correction is not being recognized, that the kidney will go to the AB candidate. So that's the principle that we thought we would see if we to model this allocation in Canada. So I really need to rely on colleagues in Canada to drive this work forward. Rob Lusky is the director of the Dalhousie University and the co-chair of the National HLA Committee. And when I mentioned this idea to Rob, this work wouldn't have happened if I didn't talk to Rob, because right away he saw the potential here and recognized the significance and really helped to advocate this work through CBS. And Mike Gillespie works with Canadian Blood Services. He's got a really cool title just called the Architect. And effectively what he does is he models out allocation, different scenario to see which one works the best. And there was our team to take this work forward to model the impact of ABO adjustment. So our study aim was to assess potential access disparity due to candidate ABO blood group in a Canadian HSP allocation system, where we permit ABO compatible offers. Again, a little different from the US. And we hypothesized that because the current policy is only based on conventional cPRA, does not account for ABO, it's going to lead to inequity. But if you were to apply this new metric, ABO-adjusted cPRA, that would resolve the disparity. So the first thing that we did is we applied the same calculation to Canada, taking the US data and applying the same metric. And we saw very similar factual correction. So we knew we're on the right track. This really is a mirror image of what happens in the United States. And then the question came, well, how are you going to measure ABO disparity? And we decided we're going to do this robustly. So we came up with 3 different ways to measure this, and I'll walk you through each one. The first one is what I call the static model. And it's a very simple model just to say, well, if your cPRA is 95%, what does that mean? It means that 5% of the donors are compatible with you. Well, is that a reality? So we can check that by going back for the past 10 years to look at all the deceased donors we cover in Canada to ask, well, how many of them were actually, as a matter of fact, are compatible with a candidate? And you would predict 5% if cPRA is a good metric. And we did that for every single candidate on the wait list, which is 10,000 candidates in Canada over the years. So that was the data that we saw. in this analysis. On the left-hand side is we simply look back to see for each candidate with their cPRA, what's the percentage of compatible donors in the donor pool. So again, 95%, you expect 5% compatible donor pool. But that was only true for the AB blood group. When you go to A, their true axis is more about 4.5%. When you go down to B and O, you can see for the O candidate, when we did a Poisson model, that the O candidates, their actual match in the donor pool was only 50% compared to blood group AB. So that confirmed our hypothesis that there is a ABO disparity in our current system. What if we were to reclassify the CPR of every candidate based on ABO-adjusted cPRA and to do the same kind of analysis? Then we saw that really all the lines, they straighten out, that really whatever we got with ABO-adjusted cPRA truly matched to the compatible donors in the donor pool. So that seems, we're on the right track. But the issue with that model is it doesn't really tell you about time to match. You can say, well, yeah, I guess, the compatibility percentage with ABO-adjusted cPRA matches better. But what about in real time, in real world, about time to match? So we wanted to do now a simulation of time to match offer. And we started with a wait list of candidates in Canada in the HSP program in 2018. And we took them, and what we did is we simulated allocation, because we know when disease donors were recovered and when they pass away, their typing was done, they all go into the central CTR system in Canada. So we know at what time point the donors came, and then whether they matched candidates or they didn't match candidate. That allows us to do a model where we can say, if we have a given candidate, how long did they take to match someone, a given donor, during this period of time from 2018 to 2022. And then we calculated again, once they match someone, we say, okay, that's great. And we waited to see how long it would take to match the next donor that came. And to lend robustness to the analysis, we simulated this 25 times and we randomized the donor sequence, because obviously sometimes donors, in real world can come in different sequences. And so that allows us to construct a time to match simulation of kidney allocation based on traditional cPRA versus ABO-adjusted cPRA. So now this is a time to match analysis. On the left-hand side, you see what happened by the current system, the current metric of cPRA, stratified by 98, 99, and 100%. And what we saw was that, as predicted, those candidates that were AB, they really had the shortest time to receive a kidney offer. And then the next one was blood group A, followed by blood group O and blood group B. And so that really layered very nicely. And I was actually a little surprised to see that we can demonstrate that effect even 98%, because we know, although they're considered highly sensitized, they're not as difficult to match as the 99 and 100. But the fact that we can even see this, and in fact, we have data to show going down to 95%, there was still ABO disparity. But if we were to ask the counterfactual scenario at the what if analysis, we went back and reallocate based by ABO-adjusted cPRA, we saw that really there was no difference in terms of these time to match offer. This is in 100%ers, the lines did not completely overlap, because for these candidates, and I'll show later on too, their problem wasn't ABO, it was more to do with the fact that they're so highly sensitized that they just didn't have any compatible HLA donors in the population that matched them during this time. So the results of the simulation show that reallocation of deceased donor kidneys resolves or improves the ABO disparity that we saw with conventional cPRA. So that is also not a perfect system, because that only considers about donor coming in, matching somebody. But we know the transplant allocation system has to take into account of someone matching, they come off the list. So they have to be removed from the list. And then there are new candidates that actually get added to the wait list as time goes on too. So here is the last analysis that we did. We did a discrete event simulation. And if you're not familiar with this type of study, what it does is to ask what if we reallocate differently. And that's the only difference we're going to do. Everything else stays the same. When the donors came into the study, stay the same. If they got matched, those candidates got removed. and when candidates get added to the HSP list also stay the same. And the only thing that we changed was the allocation based on cPRA. And we again started in 2018. We did kidney allocation per national standard policy. We didn't change that. When the top ranked candidate got matched, they were removed from the wait list. And then the wait list got replenished by new active candidates that just got added to the registry as it did in the past. And we repeated that analysis, step 2 to 3 from 2018 to 2022. And what you see on the left-hand side here is based on the conventional cPRA, we saw huge ABO disparity. The blood group O candidates, their access to transplant was at the very bottom, followed by blood group B and A and AB. And so that was exactly as what we predicted, and very satisfying to see that actually that's what came out in the model. And if we were to, in a counterfactual world, to reallocate based by ABO-adjusted cPRA, we saw that that gap between the different ABO blood groups stayed close up and they became non-significant. Now you're gonna notice that there's a line over here, which is a blood group AB. And you're gonna say, well, what the heck happened here? They're supposed to do the very best. How come in this counterfactual scenario, they did the very worst? And in fact, what we learned was that this is a consequence of accumulation of ABO disparity. Now that might be confusing to you. So here's what actually happened. When HSP started in 2013, the data elements captured was very bare. So it did not allow us to do the discrete event simulation from the very beginning of HSP. So when the data became mature enough for us to do this, it was in 2018. So our simulation started in 2018. But imagine that happens because AB, they have the best candidates, they have the best access to the donor pool. So the easy to transplant AB candidates, they were removed from the waitlist. So in this analysis, all the candidates are 100%. However, there's a big difference between someone who's 99.5, which is considered 100%, to 100.0%. So what happened here is the easy to transplant 100% for the blood group AB, they already got transplanted in the beginning of the HSP registry. So by the time we started doing the analysis in 2018 in the simulation, what accumulated here in the AB, these are the impossible to transplant AB. They all had a cPRA of 99.9 to 100%. And so that was the reason why they had the worst access, not because of ABO, just because simply they could not find a HLA compatible donor. Whereas these other candidates in O and B and A, they had a good spread of 99.5, 99.6, all the way to 100%. So they were a little different. So to make sure that that was, in fact, what happened, we excluded 99.95% plus candidates because these candidates, their issue was just the impossibility of finding a HLA compatible donor. And when we repeat that simulation, we saw that the lines, they really came together. The next part, and this is the final analysis that we did with this work, is we wanted to see what would happen to the overall efficiency of kidney allocation. Because what we show so far is that if we're to use the new metric, that the disparity between blood group will get better. But we also wanted to know what would happen to the overall efficiency, i.e., under the new system, with more HSP patients receive offers or less or about the same. And we were surprised to find that using the ABO-adjusted cPRA, more candidates in the HSP got matched and would have been transplanted compared to conventional. At 2-year simulation, 28% versus 35%. So why might that be the case? And we think is that the reasons because the efficiency of kidney allocation is improved when truly the most difficult to match candidates, they get the offers first. So in the previous example I gave you between the AB candidate and the blood group O candidate, if the cPRA metric is not correct, a less sensitized patient actually got the offer first. And that's not good because while they're transplanted, the more difficult to match person, that might be their only shot during this time, during 5 years or 6 years. And they missed it, you give it to somebody else who's less sensitized, they're not getting more offers, they're finished. Whereas if you appropriately give that one single donor to the one person, that's the only kidney they're ever gonna see, and they got it, the next person that also matched, but they're less sensitized, that's okay, because another match will come for them. They just have to wait a little longer. And I thought this analysis really very nicely demonstrated the impact of having a more accurate measure of sensitization. There's also other aspects that we're able to see with this metric as well too about disparity. One is that what about access to national interprovincial sharing? So as we said earlier, the entry to get into HSP is 95%. But look at all these candidates here. They have a cPRA just below 95%, but with ABO correction, they should really be in the HSP registry, but they're not being recognized. So all of them should be in HSP, but they're not. The other is the flip side. Amongst the candidates in the HSP, we know that the 100% trumps the 99%. The 99% trumps people below 99%. So again, if you're 98%, but you should really be considered 199%, the order of when you receive the offer will also be different. So there's two sides of the coin. One is if you're below HSP, there's inequity about who gets into HSP. And once you're in HSP, the order of your sensitization and therefore the priority of that candidate also there's inequity based on your blood group. So the conclusions are that the current Canadian ABO-compatible kidney allocation approach, it maximizes transplant opportunities for kidney candidates, but without consideration of ABO, B and O candidates, they're under-recognized for their reduced access. And that if we're to implement ABO-adjusted cPRA, it has the opportunity to improve both equity and efficiency of kidney allocation. So I want to take this work back to the US because it's a tale of two countries. So why did we go into an ABO-compatible system for highly sensitized? And I think our forefathers who designed the system did that because you want to maximize the number of donors for each candidate. But the United States decided not to do that. So just to show you what I mean, if you're a blood group A candidate, and we did this analysis at a single day in time, we just froze the data, and we asked how many candidates are waiting by blood group, and how many compatible donors there would be, and how many identical donors. So if you're a blood group A candidate, there's 24,000 candidates in the US on that single day. 23% of them will have identical donor if you only want to go identical allocation. But if you were to open it up a little more, go to compatible donors, all of a sudden, the number of donor pool increases by 3 times more. Similarly for blood group B, if you want to go by identical donors for blood group B, it's extremely dismal, 11%. But if you were to consider ABO-compatible allocation, open up the donor access a bit more, because they can now all of a sudden get access to the blood group O donors, the number of compatible donors that can match them is dramatically improved. So Lauren and I, we came up with this 2x2 table here, just really discussing this measure of cPRA and kidney allocation policy. So in the United States, they do not do ABO adjustment, but they do identical allocation. So because they do identical allocation, the issue that they have is missed opportunity. They miss the opportunity to transplant candidates because they restrict to identical blood group. But because of that, the ABO disparity issue is actually somewhat attenuated. In Canada, we did it the other way. We do compatible allocation. So we maximize transplant opportunity, which is good. But if we don't adjust for ABO effect, we actually have higher ABO disparity than the United States. So what we propose here is a combination of the two. We're one step further away from the US. All we got to do is to move it into a metric that considers ABO. So the proposed system is that we do the Canadian compatible allocation system, but we implement ABO adjustment. This way, we maximize transplant opportunity, and we also reduce disparity at the same time. And then so when we finished this work, we took it back to the United States. In UNOS right now, they're undergoing yet another major revision in their kidney allocation policy. Rather than having the sliding scale, now they want to have a composite score based on all 5 different attributes. And one of them is the candidate biology. And the candidate biology effectively means blood type and cPRA. So we told them that we developed this metric, you guys should think about it and probably apply it in your system. So what about the milestone? What have we done so far? I think very quickly, we're a little strategic is that as soon as we finish this work, we decided we want this to be implemented right away. So we took it to peer review. We published the paper first. We did a Canadian modeling data, which is now finished. We're going to be submitting this for publication. We wanted community engagement because this is something we don't want to be just in the lab. We want this to be discussed, debated, and just to see is there any issues that we actually missed during this process. We presented ATC, CST, ASHE. I just gave a Georgetown talk. And I think this work was recognized with such importance that they invited us to have a dedicated impact session in ATC next year just to discuss this concept here. And in the interim, in Canada, this concept and data was reviewed by the national, the HO advisory committee and the kidney advisory committee, and we have approval to adopt this and implement next year through CBS. So basically, this now information is passed back to CBS to start doing the IT aspects for implementation. So is the work finished? I would say no, there's a lot of work we can still do. I would say anything that has anything to do with allocation that needs cPRA has to completely change. The next step we're going to go to is to take this into kidney pair donation program. And I didn't realize this until recent years, is that in KPD, you have all these proposed matches. How do they prioritize which match will go first? It turns out some of them is based on cPRA. They have a cutoff of 80% cPRA, after which more points get added to that pair with the donor. So we can imagine, again, if they don't consider blood group, that 80% cutoff is not going to be equitable. What about impact on extra-renal organ allocation? So CBS is about to launch the new highly sensitized interprovincial sharing for highly sensitized heart candidates. They have a cutoff of 80%. So what it means is that if you're a heart transplant candidate, your CPR is 80% or higher, you qualify for interprovincial organ sharing for heart. So as soon as they said that, we said, well, what about ABO? They said, oh my God, well, you're right. So ABO is a huge effect because now you're not talking about patients that can wait on dialysis. These are life-saving organ transplants. So we're going to be talking to the heart transplant group about this policy of ABO adjustment. We'll take it to the lung group. We'll take it to the pancreas group. We already discussed. I think we have an opportunity to inform and influence kidney allocation policy in the U.S. The U.S. OPTN histocompatibility committee was very interested in this work, invited us to present this to them. I don't think it'll make it in time for the current iteration, but in the future, certainly they will consider this. There's a lot of space to elucidate ethnic disparity. So in the US, it's known that if you're highly sensitized Black candidate, they have worse access. And I can tell you 3 reasons why that's the case, which I don't think a lot of people know about, and ABO is one of them. And in Canada, with Indigenous Asian population, this is a completely new territory that's not explored. Another new idea, another thought experiment is the geography-specific ABO-adjusted cPRA. And what I mean is that the ABO donor pool composition varies between BC, Halifax, Ontario, and such. And therefore, you can imagine the cPRA in BC could very well be different from someone in Halifax. So we could develop a geography-specific ABO-adjusted cPRA. So that's a portion of work on ABO adjustment and equity, but I just want to highlight very quickly 3 other projects that we're doing that will aim to increase equity in our work. One is the precision of antibody detection methods. As all of you know, our method of antibody detection is not perfect. It's not just in our lab, it's worldwide. And I wrote a grant, we found that 80% of candidates that don't have sensitization history, they have detectable antibodies. We're able to cluster them together through computational AI machine to find out distinct patterns. And we just published a paper with Rob Lusky, who designed this really the first of its kind assay to find out how to discriminate fake antibodies from real antibodies. And this data will come out next year as well. We have this highly publicized Willing to Cross program for the ultra-sensitized patients. Through collaboration with John and others, we're going to implement a Willing to Cross program using the adopted design, and this will go live in 2023 for the impossible to transplant candidates who have a PRA of 99% or higher. And lastly, I think at the end of the day, the donor pool has to change. And I think we have a way to redefine ABO-incompatible transplants in Canada. So I was talking to all 4 folks here, Rob Lusky, Lori West, there's Ann Halpin, and Chris Kwan at CST. And I think this is all Canadian innovation. The barrier to ABO-incompatible transplant is not because of drugs, it's because of having an accurate assay to titer out anti-ABO antibodies. These assays are decades old. They're essentially obsolete. They're highly inaccurate. And that's why no one wants to do them because we don't know how to appropriately re-stratify candidates. But Rob, Lori, and Halpin came up with new methods of measuring anti-ABO antibodies, which is highly accurate and high throughput. So I think we have the opportunity to lead the way to write a new chapter of ABO-incompatible transplant. Chris Grant and his group, they are working on these enzymes that you might have heard of that can clear off the A antigen on the donor organ to facilitate essentially converting a donor into a universal donor blood group O. So I think there's a lot of work in that space to be done. So I think we strive for equity, but at the current time, the HLA and anti-ABO antibodies, they are still a major barrier. Through the work that we're doing, I think, in the next year or two, we're going to have a transformation in this area. So I want to acknowledge the people that participate in this work. Lauren, who has continued to work with me. I want to thank the Vancouver Kidney Transplant Program, John and Jack and Matt Doris, who really contributed, helped me refine the analysis, asked really tough questions to make sure we got the analysis right. Paul and Karen in the lab here continue to support me in the research work. The CBS collaboration, especially with Mike Gillespie, Howie Gable, and the UNOS folks. So with that, I'll stop here and take questions.
James, first of all, congratulations on really 2 years of work that I think is going to change allocation policy for sure in Canada, and I think in the United States. This work is exceedingly important. So first of all, congratulations. Second of all, congratulations on explaining that. One of the real challenges I think that has limited the implementation of this technology to the clinical realm is the connectivity between clinical investigators and the laboratory, and you've definitely had success in bridging that as through the collaborations that you've established. So first of all, congratulations. I think this work is important for the audience to understand. So although James is presenting it as ABO, the underlying current for this is ABO is not uniformly distributed across people of different cultural backgrounds. And James, I think that, when we talked about this initially, we said, yes, it's great to say that this is going to improve access for blood type B, but for the audience, I think we all know that if we took 100 blood type B people and put them in a room, they look very different from an ethnic and cultural makeup from the people that are blood type A. And I think that those are the kinds of messages that need to continue. So just your thoughts, James, on the challenge which comes next, which is really transmitting this work into the clinical realm, but also to the patient audience so that they understand its importance in terms of improving access. So what are the next steps in those spaces?
I think the first step, as you said, John, was even getting people to understand, like, what the heck am I talking about? Because the moment you talk about cPRA, people kind of already, their brain is not there already. So I hope through all these explanations that people understand what is it that we're trying to do here. But I think from a patient perspective, you're absolutely right. When you ask me, and you've asked me many times, who are the blood group B people? And that's a difficult question to ask, is because I don't know in Canada, because we don't phenotype them, a lot of them too. And a lot of the ethnicity fields in our data sets are missing as well too. We can very well stratify all these analysis just by ethnicity, then we can really answer the question very quickly, but we can because ethnicity data field is missing. So how do we populate that data set? What's the ABO in the indigenous population? I don't know, because they're not tested, So I think there's a lot of work to be done to capture that data, because once we have it, it's easy to do.
Yeah, what James is alluding to, and sorry, I just want to expand on this, is I think it's only through patient partnerships that we're going to get over some of what James is highlighting is the fact that in our national data system, we do not have ethnicity and cultural background accurately encoded. So to have those big data sets that have that level of granularity of information that's needed, it needs to be explained, and we need partnerships with patients so that they understand that the reason we're using this data and accessing this data is to improve equity. And I think we need to think differently. The reason we don't have that data right now, and it's been frustrating that we don't have that data, is we haven't built those bridges. And I think that that's the other piece of this. This work can't happen. So for us to understand the basis, the biological basis of inequities, we need this information in our data systems. And I think the only way to do it, James, is through patient partnerships. I'm sure Adira or others may have comments. If you have comments, please paste them in the chat. I think I have the chat open. I'm not.
It's in the Q&A, John.
The Q&A. Maybe I'm looking the wrong
Of all
spot.
the questions, yeah. So that's where all the questions are.
Okay,
yeah, no, I think the patient partnership, and I know that, James, that part of the grant that you have for the genome-wide one is we do have patients at the table trying to understand this and what their impacts are, and that's been really interesting.
Here, do you want to hit the Q&A, because I'm having trouble
yes.
finding it?
Yeah. So a couple of questions. If increases in cPRA for non-A recips, does it mean that if you have a cPRA started at, say, 20% and goes up to 50% with the ABO adjustment, does that mean that for some of the population will actually have a harder time getting transplanted?
So the axis has never really changed. So if someone's ABO-adjusted cPRA is 50%, it's always been that way. It's just that they're being viewed currently as 20% in your example here. And that's the problem, is that they always have bad access. It's just that they're not being accounted for it. So what this work is trying to do is to appropriately assign what your true sensitization score is, so you get the allocation points that belong to you in the first place.
Great. Can we apply, from Thomas Ng, can we apply ABO-adjusted cPRA to improve the quality of epitope matching that's used for allocation?
Yeah, so ABO and HLA, they're actually on different chromosomes, so they're not related that way, but they are linked in the way is that there's a bias between ABO and ethnicity, and there's a bias between HLA and ethnicity, and so there is an opportunity to combine the two together so that we come up with an overall calculator. If one day we want to go towards matching for ABO and epitope, it does open up the donor pool if one wants to consider epitope matching.
Right. No, there's a number of congratulatory comments in the Q&A, but also from Matt, given the spectrum of disparity of access to transplant within HSP and non-HSP, do you think it's time to adopt the points-based allocation algorithm in Canada that incorporates ABO-adjusted cPRA?
I definitely think that points would be very useful. I agree with Matt there. And the reason for that is because it's a log scale in terms of access disparity. It's not a linear scale. And there is no easy way to account for that unless we use the points, which is what US did and has been very successful in doing that. I agree, Matt.
Yeah, and Jag's also commenting, like, I think we're all, no pun intended, sensitive to the highly sensitized, but how does this potentially impact the way we allocate in the non-highly sensitized? I think you were starting to get to that, but I think that is the part that the people, and that would be where patient engagement would come in as well. But like, what are the trajectories that change in a non-HSP?
Yeah, so it's very interesting. So we right now know that through HSP registry, 95 to 98%, they have better access than the 0%. So if you're 0%, your transplant access is worse than someone who's 95. So that's very interesting. So imagine someone who's 90 to 94%. They are highly sensitized, but they don't quite make it into HSP. So they have to rely on local donors. And therein lies the problem, is that they're sensitized, but not enough. And those candidates are going to have a really hard time. So I agree with you, Jag, and that's why I'm interested in developing geography-specific cPRA, because it depends on which region you're in and the donor ABO composition. I think that there is work to be done there. And we have to account for that locally here. How do we help our patients who are 80 to 94%? Should we give them priority within our own province? Because right now they're being treated just by the number of dialysis days. That's the tie break between a 94 versus a 60%.
Yeah, no, that was an interesting, I think the region specific or geography specific is really interesting. I also heard Aviva talk about the notion of not just dialysis transplant days, but for other inequities like access to care, where people have to move to get dialysis, whether or not that should also count for as hardship. Kind of an interesting concept, and I think that's sort of a larger debate, obviously. And then one of our trainees, Nicholas, is asking a question with respect to how one incorporates not just the cPRA and ABO, but also some of the other nuances around patients who would benefit most. And I think that's a much larger question in terms of younger, fewer comorbidities, frequency of dialysis complications, et cetera. Not sure that you.
Yeah, I primarily talk about ABO, cPRA, and equity, but what he's talking about, Nicholas, is the utility aspects as well too. And that's the other principle of allocation, which I didn't get into today, but very important as well. And the problem is you get into a tension at some point between utility versus equity. And that's why US is now wanting to move towards that 5 attribute, where the other attributes consider efficiency, maximizing the transplant longevity, other factors too. And they want to assign a score to each one. So in the end, you get a composite score. And I think that concept is good, but it has to be, we can go on for another hour to talk about some issues.
Yeah, James, just briefly on that point, I mean, the inherent concern with prioritizing highly sensitized patients who obviously are higher immune risk is that they'll have poorer transplant outcomes, but that's not proven to be the case. So with modern immunosuppression, we're not crossing DSAs in these allocation algorithms at this point. And so in those analyses, so there's a big concern that by putting more points or priority, if you will, for highly sensitized patients, that good kidneys would be going into people who are just going to destroy them from an immunological perspective. And that hasn't proven to be the case. So there's good data about that.
Yeah, you're right. Yeah, Kyle Jackson published that one, and you're absolutely right, John. And we see the same in Canada. HSP candidates, they do just as well as non-HSP.
Yeah, no, that's really important. Well, we're at the bottom of the hour, and I want to thank you, not just for today's talk, but really for outstanding work and thoughtfulness. And I know and we think we all appreciate the amount of energy and work that goes into this kind of beautifully presented graphs, but there's a lot of energy behind that. So thank you so much for this and for the impact that we hope this will have. And have a wonderful holiday season, everybody. And thanks again, James, for all the work that you're doing. And congratulations on all the awards and publications.
Thank you very much. Happy holidays, everyone.
Thank you. Bye.
Happy holidays, folks. Bye.